broadband, then it reduces volume and the music bed will pump. And this is what bad mastering engineers do. So listen for this. And I don't mean to throw anybody under the bus, but this is when you're learning about master bus compression. Bad mastering engineers will sacrifice pumping for loudness because they don't know how to control it. Well, it's not always their fault. A lot of times they were given a product that was unregulated. So they're doing the best they can. But that's also where mid-side compression comes in. And so we'll circle back to that. That's when I would use mid-side compression. If there's an unregulated lead vocal, well, that's what you're going to shoot for because you can compress the lead vocal and the kick and the bass and whatever, but you're going to pump the center channel instead of pumping the entire record because the sides would independently not pump. So this is kind of high-end mastering theory, but it's really important to know for mixers and producers.
Right. If the center is pumping, it's not as distracting and overwhelming as if the whole mix is
Yeah, because you're listening to a lead vocal. And I'll tell you, I said this to somebody the other day. Never in 20 plus years has anyone come up to me and said, "Man, that lead vocal sucks." But what a great mix. What a great music bed, right?
Yeah.
Nobody says that because it's the highlighted thing. No one ever listens to a record and says, "Man, I hate that vocal, but I wish that guy was making my records." Doesn't work that way.
Right. No, the vocal is king.
Yeah.
/ queen.
Yeah. So they don't like it. They're not going to use you. So that same thing happens in this mid-side concept because if the lead vocal's hitting a big note, that's all you're going to hear in the mid channel. So if the bass tucks a little bit, it's like no big deal. It's momentary. It washes past you. The sides are still nice and loud. So yeah, it's an interesting thing mixing into these concepts. When you really start to grasp them, mastering engineers don't have a lot to do. And so at that point, the mastering engineer has to be someone who likes what you're doing and understands what you're doing and can really like take you to the next level, and not someone who's going to change everything. So, but that I was going to say earlier, and I think I cut myself off when I was talking about Mike Wells. When I was in his studio, my records sounded like my records on those ATCs. Like I would put my mix up and I was like, oh, that's my mix. There's another guy's studio and he's a multi-Grammy winning mastering engineer. Great guy. I went to a party at his house and I put my mix up on his mastering rig and it did not sound like my mix. And immediately I had no confidence because I said, if my mix sounds like this here, what's he going to do to my thing? He and I don't have the same taste in music, really is what I thought. And that's not to say anything about him. Dude is amazing, objectively. But that's also part of it. Just because someone's amazing doesn't mean they're the right person for you. Because if my mix doesn't sound like my mix in his studio, how is his master going to sound like my mix? It's not. He's going to change a bunch of stuff. And I don't want you to change a bunch of stuff. I want you to enhance it and optimize it based on what I'm giving you. Otherwise, you should have been the mixer. So it's a tricky relationship you have to build, but it's always a relationship. So right now, what I've discovered is I have one mastering engineer I use for pop, and I have one mastering user I use for country music. And I do a local Nashville guy for country music, and then I have a New York mastering engineer for all my pop stuff. And it's worked out well.
I totally get that. That relationship and knowing that your mix is going to be your mix and like, yeah, because I've had like mastering engineers just completely decimate your mix, and it's just like, it's like, no, that's
the other
not
hard
why
part,
you're here.
The other hard part is like, if you're listening to your new master on the same speakers you mixed it on, then all of the acoustical deficits and monitoring deficits of your system are going to double up on the things they fixed, right? Because if they're fixing things that you didn't hear or heard as lies because your system's imperfect, then when they do the fixes, it's going to sound like they screwed up because they're going to push the things that you had wrong, and they're going to double push, and they're going to sound really wrong. And you don't – so that's the other hard part, man, is if your room's not dialed in. I mean, this is literally why I pay as much as I pay to be in this commercial space. It's 360 degrees of acoustical treatment. And it's a tuned room, and then I've still got SonarWorks on it, and I've chasing speakers forever, and you get something that translates. Don't touch anything. So in the future, I do want to get a pair of those giant ATCs. I'm considering Carl Tatz's Phantom Focus system. He's a great guy, and he's here in Nashville, so I am considering his system. It's a great system, and he'll dial you in which is awesome. And he's just down the road, which means I don't have to pay for a hotel.
Well, you got PMCs now, right? You're working with
yeah,
PMCs?
I'm on PMC 228s, and this is a bit of a love-hate relationship because they're really good speakers, but there's a flaw in the speaker cone. And I believe the reason why we have the new PMC speakers that just came out, those great ones that everybody bought, is because my 228s have a flaw in the mechanics. So this is my fourth speaker cone on one side, and I've had to go through a bunch of speaker cones because there was a defect from the factory. And I don't know if PMC made them themselves. I don't know if this was an employee error, but basically there's a crease in the speaker cone. And so I'm on my fourth cone because I had to get through four of them to get to a cone that didn't have the crease.
This issue.
And so now I'm fine. But if these ever go bad, I might get rid of them. You know, I still want to upgrade past them because this room is huge and I need bigger speakers. But they're doing great for me now. And PMCs do make great speakers. And the new speakers they've made hopefully don't have this issue. Hopefully that's the point. And people love them. That's what I'm seeing for all the new Atmos setups everybody's doing. They're using the new PMCs. Yeah,
PMCs seem to be they seem to be like the number one speaker being recommended for Atmos. I have mixed feelings about Atmos. I don't know if you want to share your feelings on it, but I do want to before we get into say Atmos, which may or may not happen.
It's not going to happen because I don't have an opinion on it. Sorry to cut you off. I've never mixed an Atmos. I would love the opportunity to. I think it probably would be super fun, but that's the extent of my thoughts on it. Is that I think it's really cool for the people that can invest $100,000 in an Atmos setup, but it's going to take something significant, and I don't know if the industry is going to support it. I'm a producer who mixes, so I'm okay with right now. If I needed an Atmos mix, I'd be more than happy to give someone my Pro Tools file.
Wait, but let's go back to the mid-side thing because I don't think you finished up on the mid-side end of.
Sure.
Did you? I think there was like a thought that you were going to circle back to.
Mastering engineer Peter Dell, who holds the LA Audio Engineer Lunch, he's such a great guy. He's the one who taught me about mid-side compression because I was there at lunch and I sat next to him eating Mexican food. And I was dealing with that. And I asked him and he said, well, try a mid-side compressor. And that was really like literally in that moment, he was like, oh, that's the answer that you're looking for. And he was right. And so now what I do is I also use mid-side compression to stage how much I feed into the center channel of my mixes prior to the vocals getting recorded because you have to leave some space. So panning and how this all goes is really intricate. It's really a huge part of it. And the thing you have to always remember is anything that lives in phantom center doesn't exist. And I know that seems like such an easy statement. Be like, yeah, it's not there because it's coming out of the left and the right speakers. But we never, or at least I didn't ever up until a certain point really think that when I have bass and kick and lead vocal that are super heavy in the phantom center, half of that signal is coming out of the left speaker. And so if I don't ever consider that, I'm going to overload things that are panned hard left with too much bass. Because there's a ceiling for how much bass and low mids anything can have in a mix. And so if you've got a hard panned synth and it's just super deep and heavy, and then you've got a huge ass sub bass and kick and lead vocal in the center, and you never summed mono and EQ'd those to all work in mono, then they're never going to work in stereo. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you can get a bit more dynamic range by kind of panning things to the left and right, even with bass instruments. But there's a limit to that
because you only have a mechanical ceiling of how much bass can come out of that speaker cone on the left, and half of everything you've panned in the center is coming out of the left, and the right. You see what I'm saying? So like if you overload the lows on the far left, then you're going to be like, why can't I get my mix loud? You know what I'm saying? And then because you've gained it up so much, now you're distorting and making square waves out of sine waves, and it sounds really bad. And it's because they always say you got to be careful with the bass. This is why elliptical filters were created for vinyl records. If that's again, this is where we go down the rabbit hole. But you got to be. Really,
are you filtering out? You're filtering out the sides when you're in your mix?
Not because. Well. I'm at the fader level. That's the best way to say it. I'm far enough down the path that I'm aware of it, and so I do it at the fader level, so I don't have to do it at the bus level. But until you're at that point where you really understand it, sometimes it's easier to just do mono under filters or elliptical filters or a bus with a 80 hertz high pass filter or whatever it is to get you there. Like it's always better to just get there. So it doesn't, you know, until you really understand it and you can really hear it. So the best thing is always going to be to take whatever is occupying the lows on the hard left and right, pan at center, jack it up 6 dB, and make sure it works on an EQ with your bass and your kick. And then pan it back, reset the unity volume. And I mean, depending on your pan law, you know, I usually work at +3, I believe. I have to check it, but I think it's +3. Although I could be wrong. I think my summing mixer, I have an analog summing mixer. It might be 0. But you have to kind of, you know, pan law. That's the thing. So however you set it, it's going to change. But yeah, you got to do that. You got to really pay attention to these things and take the time. And they don't seem linear. It seems like what a time waste to stop and have to do this, but it's only twice, right? It's only one thing on the bottom left and one thing on the bottom right, but that'll save the low end of your mix. And a huge part of the sound that I get is the warm, thick low end of the mix. I like Neve sound. I like that punchy, warm thing. And you can't get that without really controlling the low mids, which is like 100 to 300 hertz, and the bass.
Yeah.
I don't know if I abide by the standards of what people call mids, low mids, whatever. But to me, you have your sub bass, you have your bass. Those all kind of feel like one category for me. Subs is just sort of really anything under 60 hertz, right? I know that sounds weird, but when I'm thinking about like the low, that's what I'm looking for, because the fundamental of a tonic on bass can often go up into 100, 150 hertz, 200 hertz if they're playing up the neck of a bass. So you have to be a little bit more broad on those regions. But how people deal with 200 to 300, because the fundamental of a male vocal usually lives between 150 and 250 hertz, and the fundamental frequency of the notes sung by a female tend to live somewhere around 250 hertz. So if you have all this 250 hertz happening between all these guitars, then the female vocal is always competing, right? Same thing with the male.
Yeah.
So you're thinking about these things in how they work together. So this actually ties back to the Jack Joseph Puig, so we'll come full circle story, is that one of the things he and I talked about, he said everything is too loud. You have too many things screaming at the same time. It's chaotic. It's too many elements. And I used to think that I was using the pan sphere. I used to think that I was putting it to its best use by filling it. But the reality is that I think we like things that kind of rock like a boat. A little bit on the left, the next section's a little bit on the right. I think we like moving around and like, look over there, because you don't know where to look / listen if there's two things happening at the same time as the lead spotlighted thing. So what he said to me was that you've forgotten the foundation of all pop music is counterpoint theory. How far back you want to go in, you know, the Beatles or whatever, it's like you go back farther than that. Like counterpoint theory for the orchestra is modern pop music at its core. We still use the Roman numeral system and how orchestras have been charted and the progressions. It's just the Nashville number system we use now. So nothing's changed. Like the pickpocket thing. When you overload the brain with too many things at once, you don't know where to look. And so there's a basic rule of 3. And so it's in counterpoint, it's melody, counter melody, and rhythm. And it's really that simple. Melody, counter melody, rhythm. The fourth element really screws up a mix. And that's not to say that when I say, I used to say, I don't know what the right word for it is, but element should be spotlighted. Because what you can do with the faders is that depending on how you gain stage things and how you balance things in your mix, I shouldn't say gain stage, depending on how you push the faders to balance your mix, things join or leave the band, which is the rhythm. In a 90-person orchestra, who's spotlighted at any one time? Well, the orchestra usually divides into sections: melody, counter melody, and the band, the rhythm section, right? Same thing with a lead guitar. He's the counter melody while the lead vocalist is singing the melody, and they do their little fills and in between. Well, the fills are really a passing of the torch of the lead melody. So it's not counter melody.
The call and response.
Yeah, it's like those little pockets in between where I can noodle and it doesn't overpower the lead vocal, so you're never confused. It's just filling in the gaps. That's not counter melody. Counter melody would be something behind the lead melody happening concurrently that goes somewhere else. That's a wonderful thing, usually a different rhythm. But point is, it's like maybe it's a riff. Maybe the guitars are doing this badass riff. If you think about Rage Against the Machine, it's